Hi friends, so this video is an updated and refined version of my previous video. My camera settings, I already messed up. My camera settings for natural light pet photography. The reason that I wanted to update this video ASAP is because I've grown and I've learned so much as a pet photographer in the past several months, and there's more information that I wanted to include in this video to help you guys out. So if you have watched that video, awesome, but this one is a total retake. So let's talk about it. All right, naturally, as a pet photographer, I get a lot of questions from my community, my audience, you guys, all about camera settings, specifically when photographing pets in manual mode and with natural light. So if you're watching this video right now and you don't shoot manually yet, some of this, guys, might be lost on you if you have not yet learned all about how to manipulate your ISO, aperture, and shutter speed, and just have a sort of basic understanding of those settings. Additionally, if you photograph in manual mode, I also recommend photographing in RAW. Why? Because shooting in RAW gives you more data to work with for post-processing, and the file sizes are much larger for producing large artwork if you're doing IPS. So if you haven't started photographing in RAW, do so, highly recommend it. Also, if you popped in here and you wanted to know what equipment that I use to photograph pets, I'm gonna leave this video above for you to check out. All right, so as I mentioned, for the time being, I am a natural light pet portrait photographer. Me personally, I like the look and the aesthetic of natural light, and some of these settings are where I just start for each session and then deviate from there depending on my session goal and what final result I'm trying to achieve. So as much as possible, I love to shoot with my aperture anywhere from 1.8 to 2.8. I want a very shallow depth of field. Obviously, your aperture is gonna be dependent on your lens's capabilities and how low that aperture can go for that lens. And I adore when an animal's eyes are in focus and then the focus kind of falls and softens outside of their face, making whatever is in the background and the foreground more blurred and kind of delicate and beautiful. And a low aperture is also useful when I shoot through leaves or flowers or greenery, and it adds texture and depth not only to the foreground, but then the animal's gonna be the main focus of the image, which I just feel like is really, really beautiful. So those are a couple of reasons why I shoot that 1.8 to 2.8. I kind of wanted to give you an idea of why I do that. Say I want to get the animal more in focus in their environment, I'm gonna pop that aperture up to something like f4, f5.6, heck, even f11, depending on the available light, so that more of the image, the pet parents, and this amazing location is gonna be full focus. And increasing my aperture is really also to give my clients an additional option from their session, so they have some images that are really sharp and really in focus, and then others that are just softer and a little bit more dainty, if you will. I should also note that I don't usually go any higher than, say, a 5.6, because with pets, it's likely that you will need to keep your shutter speed higher to freeze motion. So if you're pushing your aperture up, you're losing a lot of available light, and we're going to talk about shutter speed in just a moment. So the last thing that I want to say about aperture before we move on, and listen close, you guys, is if you're having trouble getting pets in focus, meaning that their eyes are tack sharp, then I want you to start photographing them at a slightly higher aperture. I don't want you to start at 1.8. And the reason for this is when you move to a higher aperture, say 5.6, you're increasing the depth of field, meaning the space of the image that will be sharp or in focus, or your margin of error, is a lot wider and a lot bigger, so that you are much more likely to have the pet in focus. Versus 1.8, your depth of field is really, really small. You don't have as big of a margin of error of getting the shot in focus, especially their eyes and their face. So practice first shooting at a much higher aperture, and then when you feel like you've got focusing nailed down, then I would recommend you start to decrease and shoot with those more wide open apertures. It's just gonna help you a lot more in the long run. Now, to recap, aperture is the first thing that I set before I adjust my shutter speed or my ISO, any of my other settings. And that's because, as you guys know, I have a very specific style that I like to aim for, and that wide open aperture helps me get there. Then I go into changing and adjusting my shutter speed for the task at hand. So let's talk about shutter speed. Now that we're keeping our aperture wide open, as they say, the next setting that we're gonna change is that beautiful shutter speed. So remember, we're working with non-stop wiggly creatures, so our shutter speed has to be high enough that we freeze that motion, whether it's slow motion or it's fast action. And this is gonna depend on the dog, the situation, the available light, and even how much you're able to push up your ISO based on your camera body. So with that in mind, I try not to drop my shutter speed lower than 1/500 since I generally shoot with a 50 or 35 millimeter. And the rule of thumb for this is that the minimum shutter speed states that the shutter speed should be double or more than the lens focal length. All right, I'm gonna just explain that a little bit. So in other words, if you were using a 50 millimeter lens, your shutter speed would need to be at least 1/100th of a second or faster to account for camera shake. But obviously we're working with pets, so I'm gonna amp that up to say 1/500. And I have found that going any lower is not only gonna account for a camera shake, but you're gonna get motion blur, especially when you're working with rambunctious, crazy shelter dogs or puppies. So my base shutter speed for a session is 1/1000. If the dog is focused or trained or mellow, maybe 1/800 if I need the additional light, but most often I'm gonna just set it at 1/1000, which is my total happy place. So aperture 1.8 to 2.8, and then shutter speed is gonna be 1/1000. But what if you wanna photograph action? Then you need to change your shutter speed significantly. In other words, high as it can go. So how high you can bump your shutter speed is again going to depend on your available light, your camera's ISO abilities, the animal that you're working with, and your ultimate goal, because some pets are going to be way faster than others. Now, just to give you an example of this, I had a shelter pup that I photographed recently, Layla, who I'll drop an image here, who was so fast. She ran so fast, and I had to increase my shutter speed in order to capture her frozen and in focus. So based on the light that I had, I could increase my shutter speed to 1/5000 to get her in focus, but it was still like a touch soft because that was probably me moving in that motion to track her. So, you know, you can't win them all. But I wish that I could give you a really good hard and fast rule when it comes to choosing the right shutter speed. But in reality, all of those factors that I keep mentioning to you guys, I just want you to have this in your brain: available light, the animal, your ISO, your aperture, your camera's shutter speed ability are gonna all play into your decision as to what shutter speed you're actually able to use. So to recap, 1/1000 for portraits and slow motion, but if shooting fast action, bump your shutter speed as high as it can go for your camera body and also for the available light in order to maintain correct exposure and freeze that beautiful action that we're working to capture. Now that leads me into talking about our friend ISO. ISO is the last setting, guys, that I will change once I've put my aperture and my shutter speed where I want it, again, based on what I'm trying to photograph and the end result that I'm looking for. So ISO allows me to dictate how sensitive my camera is to gathering light. The higher my ISO, the more sensitive the sensor is to light. The lower my ISO, the less sensitive. You guessed it, more sensitivity equals more light. Less sensitivity equals less light. I use my ISO to maintain a correct exposure once I've set all of my settings where I want. That's it. That's all I use ISO for. All right, but a note that I want to bring up about ISO. First, your camera might be really sensitive to an increase in ISO. Most beginner cameras don't do as well in lower light and have a lower ISO scale. So the higher that you boost that ISO, the more noise, that's a term you'll hear thrown around, in an image. And I'll show you an image here that has a lot of noise. More expensive camera bodies though have a lot more forgiveness and that they perform better, they're higher quality in low light and have a much higher ISO scale. So if I boost my ISO in my camera, I'm not getting quite as much noise as quickly or for as much ISO, if that makes sense. So I want to hone this point just a little bit further. I used to have a Canon Rebel T7i, and that's what I learned photography on. And if I pushed my ISO to 800 or heaven forbid 1600, I had so much noise in my images. The image I just showed you a moment ago was from my previous camera. And that's why, because I had pushed the ISO, there was a lot of noise in the image. So sometimes the noise, when you're using a more rudimentary camera body, it can be to the degradation of the image. But with the R6, which is a mirrorless camera that I use now, I can push my ISO to like 25,000 and it's gonna have nowhere near the same amount of noise as my previous camera at ISO 1600. But if noise doesn't bother you in an image, and if that's the case, you're gonna have probably a little bit more wiggle room and feel more comfortable adjusting your ISO. Me personally, I don't know, it's just there as an addition to maintain correct exposure for me, but I don't love a lot of noise in my images. So in other words, I will only change my ISO if I absolutely have to, because I don't love a lot of noise in my images unless it's intentional to create more of that film look and aesthetic. And of course, I'll only change it to make sure that I'm balancing out my exposure and having the correct exposure. Generally, I try as often as possible to keep my ISO from like 200, 400, 800, 1600, but that's not always possible. In that photo of Layla that I just showed you, my ISO on that image was actually 10,000, but that's also because my shutter speed was so high, I needed to account for the increase in shutter speed to make sure that I had enough light to capture her in focus. Alright guys, so to recap, as a natural light pet portrait photographer who specializes in magical, heartfelt, and vibrant imagery, celebrating dogs being dogs, I generally keep my aperture at either 1.8 to 2.8, an ISO of 200, 800 on a good day, and a shutter speed of at least 1/1000. Obviously, these are going to change. You're going to find yourself in a situation where you're going to have to go out of those typical settings that I just shared with you, depending on the location, the goal that you're trying to achieve, all of those fun things that I've really reiterated in this video. But for me personally, those are base settings. Those are the starting point of where you can just have like a foundation, and then you can adjust and change from there. So I hope this refreshed video, this updated video was helpful for you. And if you're just getting started into pet photography, you're looking to refine your style and, I don't know, try these settings out, let me know how it goes for you in the comments. Or if you're someone who is a more established pet photographer and you just wanted to learn from another pet photographer, let me know if you also thought that this video was helpful. I don't know, all the things. Subscribe to my channel for more high quality pet photography content. Like this video. I'll be back with another video again soon. As always, be kind and rescue dogs. Thanks for watching.